welcome back. Once again, it is wonderful to have you here with us today as we explore Faith for Tomorrow. This morning, we have been challenged by our first faculty panel, provoked, some might even say, inspired by the talents of our students, and heartened by a message from our founding dean, Dr. Bill Leonard. Now we return for a second panel of our esteemed faculty who have joined us here today. So it is my pleasure to welcome today Dr. Elizabeth Odell Gandolfo, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Earley Associate Professor of Catholic and Latin American Studies. Would you join us? Dr. Derek Hicks, Associate Professor of Religion and Culture. Dr. Austin Rivera, Assistant Professor of Church History. Dr. Katherine Shaner, Associate Professor of New Testament Studies. Stacy Smallwood, Executive Director of the Faith Compass Center. And Dr. Neal Walls, Associate Professor of Old Testament Interpretation. Dr. Gandolfo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Hannah. And thank you all for being here. Welcome. Welcome back to those who were here this morning. Welcome if you're just arriving. We are so excited to be together today. I am loving the energy in this place. Today, I feel it in my heartbeat, in my breath, and in a very stimulated mind right now. We had a wonderful panel this morning, a wonderful sermon at chapel, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what our second panel of colleagues have to say today. I feel like that energy that's flowing through this place is the Spirit kind of bursting forth with great life amongst us today. And so I want to echo Dr. Craneshaw's gratitude for that Spirit. My overriding feeling about this place is one of gratitude. Last year in chapel, I don't remember anything about that chapel service except Sophie Carter handing out friendship bracelets. And mine says gratitude. So I'm definitely feeling the gratitude today. I don't wear jewelry. I'm allergic to metal, and it's just not my thing. But I always had my friendship bracelet on this year to remember how grateful I am for so many things in life, but especially this place and this community and these colleagues. The other word that I think I will lead with here is inspiration. I'm grateful and I'm inspired by everything we've heard today thus far, which is an echo also of what we do every day, day in and day out in this building, in this community, and what you all do out in your own context, in your communities, your families, your congregations, other spaces of ministry and community life. I'm inspired, and I believe that that is also a word of the Spirit, right? We're inspired, we're breathed into by that Spirit of life. In Spanish, the word for that is animar. The communities that I lived with in El Salvador used the word animators for their faith community leaders. Animators, animadores, people who infuse life into their community and their people. And I feel that every day in this place, and I felt this morning, and I look forward to all of the inspiration we will receive here this afternoon as well. So to remind us all of our questions that we have on the table, we are provoking some thought here around the questions, what does it mean for Wake Forest University to have a School of Divinity? What is pressing Wake Divinity beyond our certainty and ourselves, demanding more than we ever dreamed possible? So I'll hand it right on off to Dr. Derek Hicks.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? I'm assuming this is on. Okay. I will try not to bore you since you just finished lunch. But I am so grateful to Dean Walker and to founding Dean Leonard and all of those. Of course, one of my children is calling me right now. It always happens even in class. But all of those who have gotten us here to this point of 25 years and an opportunity to celebrate where we are, but more than that, for us to find our voice in terms of what it is that we have still yet to do. And so I think that Dr. Gandolfo started us off well in terms of what we need to be thinking about, not only as an institution, but as leaders who are going out into a lost world to really deeply consider what our call is. And so for those of you who know me, you know I am preoccupied with finding and giving voice to the silenced. Unsung voices arise from the void. We don't hear them coming because the intent is for us never to hear them at all. We would not gather our thoughts around their perspectives. We would never behold their joys and their accomplishments. Whether in book or in classroom, in film or in the political sphere, unsung voices too often and intentionally remain silent. And yet their silence in juxtaposition to the loud voices speaking on their behalf need not be accepted as the truth. Our work in theological education positions us to both call up and call out the stories left behind or on the scraps, such as the story of my grandmother who in Colfax, Louisiana, at the age of 12 in 1940, came of age while cleaning the menstrual rags of the white women and girls whose homes she helped her grandmother, who was a domestic, to clean. Sadie and her grandmother, Hattie, would follow the Southern protocols of entering and exiting the back doors and taking their meals on the back porches of the white homes they served. This was Sadie's story, lifted from the void. She lived an experience of conforming to narratives she did not write, silenced by Jim Crow South. But this was her story, one she told me in advanced years. It was a story that required both a grasping with the social and political realities of that day and her coming to a narrative of her own well-lived life. Sadie's moments of reflection comes in acquaintance with James Baldwin's own wrestling with the English language itself. Baldwin claims that he, as a black writer, was born into a language he had to change, that the assumptions of the English language functioned as his enemy. He had to reckon with being black as sin, black as night, black-hearted, and all of the negative connotations associated with his beautiful flesh. He therefore escaped for a time to go into his own silence. There, across the Atlantic, he would find a voice to disrupt the socially constructed narratives articulated by some about his flesh. He would find his stories embedded in the English language itself. Sadie and Baldwin came to a radical realization that if power is in the hands of the storyteller, we must strongly consider who gave us the definitions of ourselves in the first place. More than that, we all must rewrite the definitions for ourselves, our theological considerations, must both ask questions and form new answers about the orientation of the human. Our efforts must share in Baldwin's work to curatively recalibrate false narratives about the nature of subjugated flesh. We must identify both the reactions and subjugation and unearth the beauty of the perspective and proactive expressions of full humanity for those who refuse to be 3/5 human. They be amended 5/5 human. And so, led by founding Dean Bill Leonard 25 years later, theological provocation is to disrupt those customs, even from within the church, that refuse to let the silenced speak. And what do the silenced have to say? I believe we do well to draw from the words of Ghanaian-American writer Taye Selassie, who said, and I quote in part, "I insist upon my right to be multiple. I insist upon my right to be multiple, a complex subject. Even more so, I insist upon the recognition of my multiplicity and my complexity. And while I insist upon this, I no longer take pains to explain or defend it, because that is an exhausting, repetitive, and draining project," quote unquote. Wake Divinity, we are poised to help those who are silenced in any way to see the related value between their subjectivity and their story. Because, as the mother of womanist theological ethics, Katie Cannon, once told me in our only one-on-one conversation, story gets us into the Holy of Holies in ways that actual history never can. Our stories disclose the true nature of our voices, and our voices disclose our lives. And we are among those called to give life to dead places. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'd like to, as everyone has done, thank my colleagues, thank Dean Walker and everyone who has contributed to putting together this conversation and this whole day, really. So in answering this question, this provocation that has been put before us, I thought I would begin with how I think of an institution like Wake Divinity School. I think of Wake Divinity School as a thinking organ of the church. A thinking organ of the church. This is reflected in our mission to equip agents of justice, reconciliation, and compassion in Christian churches and other ministries. And it's reflected in at least the origin story that I've been told of the origins of this community in various upheavals within the Baptist world. And so as a thinking organ of the church, our horizon and our mission is to be understood within the mission and the horizon of the church. And thus, to echo the words from Bill Leonard's inaugural address that we're meditating on here, we are called beyond ourselves at the most fundamental level. The church is the community of those being transformed into the likeness of God. The church is a community of human beings becoming divine. It is the body of waters flowing from Jesus, the human God, the divine human, as the head and font. It is the face of the earth that the Holy Spirit renews. Justice, reconciliation, and compassion are divine actions and dispositions. And in making them our own actions, we participate in the divine, and we share in that process of the divinization of our humanity. This is the fundamental Christian vocation. Our humanity is to become a divine humanity, which is indeed the truth of humanity. Our horizon, then, as a divinity school, is the divine horizon of the church. But this horizon of the church is also, of course, simply the horizon of what it means to be human. To become divine is simply what it means to become truly human and humane. The life of Jesus is simply what it looks like to live a truly human life, a truly humane life. This is significant for Wake Divinity, which is not just a thinking organ of the church, but is also located within a secular university. The Christian understanding that the church's vocation can also be understood simply as the human vocation means that this is not a fundamentally adversarial relationship, being an organ of the church in a university. On the contrary, when we are at our best, we serve as a mirror, revealing to the university community what the university also at its best is all about. Now, a secular neoliberal university does not generally understand itself according to a divine horizon, but in claiming to seek truth, in claiming to seek after the inculcation of a humane way of life, which is something that our university names more explicitly than many others in our motto, Pro Humanitate, in doing these things, the university is necessarily also oriented to a transformation into something divine. In the divinity school, we name this explicitly. And indeed, we more intentionally hope that this is what we are embodying. And when we do that, we become a mirror in which the university as a whole can see its true self. In other words, if we accept this call as being a part of the church, a call to something beyond ourselves, we can embody an intellectual community that, on the one hand, will appear very different from other intellectual communities in the university, but is also a picture of what the university is trying to be, even if it does not know it. As we continue to conduct our life together as an intellectual community, open to the transforming work of the Holy Spirit, as my colleague so eloquently talked about, this is the mirror we can hope to become as we are drawn beyond ourselves by the one who is beyond all things to become something more than we could imagine.
I need to echo the same gratitude. I'm privileged to be on the stage with you all. And thank you, Dean Walker, for the opportunity, and to all those who've made Wake Div what it is over the last 25 years. And for me, as I was thinking about our prompt this morning, two questions come to mind as we think about the mission statement of Wake Div. These two questions, I think, drive a justice-oriented, compassionate, and reparative theological education. The first question is, who's missing from our usual stories of faith? Second question, what understandings of justice, compassion, and reparation are left out of our institutions and pulpits and spiritual life? If theological education is to be provocative, we need to attend to these questions. It is precisely the voices we often think don't matter who need to come to the center of our awareness. It's not those who already know how to speak the language of church, or the idiom of biblical quotation, or the jargon of spirituality. It's those who hunger for something larger, more communally and equitably shaped than themselves. Those voices should be the ones that guide us. And those of us who do speak the language of church, the idiom of biblical quotation, the jargon of spirituality, we need to attend to the challenge of that provocation. One way to do this, and I know you're all going to be shocked, is through biblical interpretation. But I'm not going to talk about just any kind of biblical interpretation, because biblical interpretation in its historic modes has enabled oppressive, authoritarian, exclusionary, trauma-inducing religious formation. These are the modes of biblical interpretation that we need to unlearn. We need to reorient our biblical witness around paradigms of provocation for the sake of creating opportunities for justice, reparation, and compassion in our churches, and more importantly, in the world beyond. And so these two questions we need to keep asking, and we need to keep finding ways of retelling our stories through these two questions. Who's missing? Whose voices are missing? And what's left out? Whose voices do we not hear in our biblical stories, even when they're clearly present? What impulses toward justice or reparation or compassion are left out of those stories? So I want to start this thought process with the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. Many of us know this well. Jesus and the disciples are going home to Galilee through Samaria. They stop at Jacob's well. The disciples go into the city for food. Jesus asks for water, and a theological dialogue ensues with a woman among equals. The woman, after the conversation, goes back into the city as the disciples return. The woman then comes back with a whole community of people searching for living water that she and Jesus have just talked about. She's often called for this the first evangelist because she brought the first people out to meet Jesus. Now, commentators talk about Jesus as the paragon of inclusion in this story, but it's actually not the case at all. Notice that Jesus, if you had your Bible open, you could notice this even better. By the way, it's John chapter 4. Notice that Jesus simply asks for water and then talks to the woman as a religious equal. We, as interpreters, follow the disciples' lead in suggesting that there's a problem with Jesus' conversation partner being a woman, and a sexually questionable woman at that, with multiple husbands and a man on the side. But notice what we do as interpreters. We create conditions for the woman that assume either trauma or sexual promiscuity, leading to shame and marginalization from her community without hearing these conditions come from her voice, or even from Jesus, for that matter. But I would argue that these conditions we create for this woman reflect our need to build shame into our traditions, more than a need for its actual presence. When we create conditions of shame for this woman in relationship to Jesus, we are usually trying to do one of two things. Either reinforce shame as a category of women's existence for the sake of a Jesus who overlooks that shame, rather than a Jesus who doesn't need it. Or we celebrate our progressiveness, since we know, better than those people did back then, that we should welcome women, sexualized minorities, racialized non-white people, name your favorite outsider here. What we fail to realize in Fotini's story is that she is the one who was visioning, creating, forming, leading a whole community long before Jesus stopped at that well for a sip of water. That's the only explanation I can come to for why a whole community that comes out to the well at noon to see a foreign traveler who preaches against their ancestral traditions and claims to be the Messiah, the Anointed One, would be there. This stranger has vaunted disciples who would themselves go on to become leaders in the church, disciples who would go into the city but only bring back mere victuals. They don't bring back people to meet their divinely inspired leader. What witness have these followers, these disciples, made to those who sold them olives, bread, wine, and cheese? Clearly, they had neither skills for telling about Jesus nor the relationships to bring people to him. If she were a scorned woman, as the commentators say, why would the whole community believe her and follow her to the well? But what if she is the community organizer, the religious visionary, the theological griot, the wisdom-filled leader in her city? What would we begin to understand about the power of voices we disregard or spurn or worse yet, silence? What will we begin to understand about the power of community, of caretaking, of proclamation, of teaching, of gathering, of the body of Christ in this world? The woman at the well, whom tradition names Fotini, offers us one possibility for thinking through some of these questions provocatively. Will we be ready to recognize God among us? Will we be ready to recognize God among us? We have to trust that those who we'd rather shame, we have to embrace those who we would rather spurn, we have to follow those who we rather stayed home, because provocation in biblical studies, as well as in theological education, requires us to ask, who's missing? What's left out? And to put those missing and left out at the center of our new stories.
This would be the moment where I could take half of what I have here in front of me and just say it's already been said. But I want to think about theological education in terms of action, and this action, in this case, is the quest for health equity. So health equity is the state in which everyone has the opportunity to achieve their optimum level of health and well-being, no matter their physical or social location. A quest for health equity, then, requires a commitment to seeing those who are often marginalized, historically excluded, and intentionally exploited. It compels us to curate space and champion policies that recognize people as full human beings and don't reduce them to flattened, fallacious facsimiles of everything our society has taught us to abhor. So let's consider this in the lens of HIV in America. There are approximately 1.2 million people living with HIV in the United States, and the demography of HIV does not follow the composition of the population. The people most affected by, either living with or vulnerable to HIV, are Black and brown, LGBTQ+, people with substance use disorders, people living in the South. These are the people who are often considered to be the last. And so the HIV stigma enacted around this disease, this condition, both mirrors and magnifies the stigmas, the othering, the victim blaming, the criminalizing that have historically been applied to these intersectional identities, rendering them visible only by their vulnerability and not their vibrance. And so it is into this space that the theological education that takes place here at Wake Div enters. A mission to tell a different story about HIV, but also about other human conditions. One that is not of stigma, but rather a narrative that affirms the lives of people who are both living with chronic conditions and vulnerable to them. That we use theology to break ideologies that demean and dismiss, to emphasize that we are beautifully and wonderfully made, and that beauty and wonder should be celebrated, not denigrated. And to me, this is emblematic of the theological praxis that is central to the mission of Wake Div. That if we are called to love the Lord our God with all our heart and our neighbor as ourselves, we need to think more expansively about who our neighbors actually are versus who we deem worthy enough to be our neighbor. This is also the space where we recognize that faith and health are interlocking, and while most literature suggests that religious involvement and spirituality are associated with better health, that's not the case for everyone, especially those affected by HIV. So what do we do to shift that paradigm? What would it mean for us to see our neighbors accurately and love our neighbors fiercely, to celebrate the bodies that dance and sing and spin and dip and love out loud? This is the work of justice in language, in policy, and in theology that wakes us from our slumber to create the uplifting space in which those who have been labeled last can truly be valued as first.
Thank you for all of that. I thought I'd take a running start to get to today's question. My response to the original query was, well, we are still provoking after all these years because we are still nimble after all these years. Jill Cranshaw and I have outlasted, I think, all the other people who are currently in the Divinity School. So I thought I'd just bring a little history to bear on these provocations. How provocative was it in 1999 to open an ecumenical school of divinity at Wake Forest University? We're one of only 5 or 6, I can't get the number quite right, ecumenical schools of divinity at universities. And we're the only one, the dean tells me, that was founded explicitly to be ecumenical. So from the very beginning, we have been open and affirming and welcoming to those who want to come ask big questions. And what a ragtag group we were at the beginning. James Dunn, oh my gosh, if you haven't met James Dunn, talk about provocative. Bill Leonard describes James Dunn when he was still alive as the last living Texas Democrat, which was appropriate to his irascible character. But James used to refer to the faculty as Bill Leonard's irregulars, because we were an odd group. We had a Benedictine monk teaching spirituality. You can imagine he and Phyllis Tribble disagreed on a number of issues. We had Frank Tupper, who was a refugee from Southern Baptist Seminary, talking to us about the difference between 3 p.m. theological questions and 3 a.m. theological questions. Again, this long list of us at the time. Mark Jenkins, sorry, can't read my own writing, Brad Braxton, Kitty Amos, and others. It was an audacious thing to open a school of divinity at that point. Again, an ecumenical school where we really encourage robust disagreements. I had to write that down because when I was younger, when people asked me what I was looking for in a student here, I'd say, oh, I'm looking for a fight. But what I meant was I'm looking for robust disagreements about these big questions, because our ecumenicity has always been, of course, more than just Christian churches. We've had a history of having, a few at least, Jewish, Buddhist, pagan students and others who come here to wrestle with these large theological issues. So again, I would argue we've been provocative from the first. And we've been nimble in this, in how we respond to various issues at the time. Again, I had to write a list to remind myself of some of this. In the beginning, one of the ragtag group was Doug Bailey, who is a mentor of urban missions as a pastor of an Episcopal church in Memphis, who brought that to us and led trips to New York City. Because of our students pushing us in this direction, we started talking about food and faith under Gail O'Day, and that led to the hiring of Fred Bonson, and eventually into our current focus on sustainability and ecofeminism. Michelle Voss deepened our discussion of interfaith dialogue. That continues to this day. Again, race, class, reparations, social justice has always been centered to what we've been doing here, as long as, again, the spirituality of individual virtues, trying to wed personal development, each of you students honing your own theological voice as your major enterprise here, but also us as a group talking about systemic issues of social justice. And of course, travel opportunities, beginning in Cuba, going to South Africa, India, the Holy Land, Nicaragua, Greece and Turkey, I think a couple times Romania. That was an odd one. As we expand our borders and expand our horizons. Again, I think we've always been provocative in that sense. And I would conclude by saying, and we're provocative, as I said, because we're nimble, in that we don't know what's coming next. As I just again think, as Bill Leonard said, September in 2001, that was unexpected. We couldn't have prepared for that, but we had to respond to it. I remember being in the lower auditorium watching Obama being sworn in and everyone rising to their feet when he took the oath of office. Again, the 2008 recession, Trump, the pandemic, etc. We began as a school that recognized we were looking towards a future of post-denominationalism. And now, 25 years later, maybe we're thinking about being post-congregational as we invent new ways of doing the church after the pandemic. So my conclusion is, again, we are still provocative. We're still provoking each other, ourselves, our deans, our students, to respond to whatever comes around the bend next, because we're not sure what that's going to be. And it is a rare and precious thing that I've been more and more cognizant of recently, that we still have the backing of a major university that pays to keep a divinity school as a center of campus, as the moral compass, as our provost likes to say. So again, let us continue being nimble, and let us continue being provocative. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I feel all the more grateful and inspired and provoked. One of the things I love about this community is that our students also provoke us. And so to start off with just a more casual, informal question and answer period, I'm curious if any of you have a word to speak to that experience. Because we're not a divinity school where we stand up and lecture in front of 100 students and have TAs who do the small group discussions. We sit in a circle or in small groups or really just cultivate conversation in our classes, and I have learned so much from that experience. After my first 6 years here, I said I learned more in these 6 years than I did in my 6 years of PhD studies, right? So I'm curious if anyone would have something to say to that experience where you have been provoked by our community as a whole, but specifically students in the classroom, in the hallways, in chapel, and so forth.
Can we just name names of everyone here?
Right.
Because I'm seeing a few out there who I know have shaped who I am as a scholar and a teacher, and gratitude, so much gratitude for that. But I will tell a story from early on in my career here. I came 12 years ago, and I had finished my dissertation about a year before that. And, you know, eager, I was teaching the basic premise of it, and a student came up to me after class and went, that's bull. I don't agree. No, what you're saying is, and she mirrored back to me the nightmare of what I thought my dissertation was exactly not about. And I realized that it didn't matter whether I thought I was teaching exactly the right, precise thing in the classroom. What actually mattered was what was heard. And that I was responsible for what was heard. And of course, I knew this as a preacher too, but I think one of the gifts of being a professor here is that in feeling that responsibility for what's heard, we also get to hone what gets heard outside of these halls. You all who are current students here, you all who are alums, you all who are colleagues, you are the ones who give us the space to try new ideas and to tell us when they're not quite so great.
I think I would echo that because what I recall most in terms of what I've learned as a faculty member has been in those moments when students have really had to wrestle with something we engaged. I remember conversations with Sister Mia Sloan and how she'd be like, Doc, I'm struggling with some of this material you're giving. And I don't know that any of our conversations, anything was reconciled by the end of them back then. And I used to try to think of, what magic thing can I say to get her to the next level of understanding or application or what have you. But it wasn't until later, after she graduated, and our conversations then, where she started synthesizing the struggles then and applying them to the transformation that she was feeling now, right? And I don't take credit for that more than it makes me realize the extent to which what we are doing sometimes relates to planting a seed that may not grow until later. But number two, we've got to be in position to allow that process to happen and stop trying to force it, right? Which gets me to a more recent experience, two experiences actually, both in Alabama, in Montgomery, Alabama, with my students as we traveled back in 2000 and then in 2024 on our civil rights tour, and the leadership that my students, both in both instances took after we came back from Selma, Alabama. The tensions in both cases were high. There was struggle. I see Tyra back there laughing. There was struggle during those moments. And the leadership of the students who foregrounded themselves to get us to gain a deeper understanding of how not only to process the pain that we had witnessed, but also to create opportunities to apply what we had witnessed and what we had experienced to our vocational, ministerial, even our political efforts and lives going forward. And I owe that to the students, because in both instances I had to sit back and be quiet. And I don't always trust doing that.
I'm thinking of one of the things that I appreciate most about our culture and our student body here is the boldness that actually comes from humility. And let me say what I mean by that. There are a lot of academic settings where everybody in the classroom is worried about making sure they appear smart, and more importantly, that they appear smarter than the other students, and more importantly, that they appear smart to the professor. That's not how we roll here. And from that humility of not being worried about posturing, not being obsessed with this self-presentation, ooh, I'm at Wake Forest Divinity School, I should be important because I'm at this big, beautiful, important campus. Who cares? We're here to talk about God. And so one of the things that means is that I often experience a boldness from our students in telling me when something is not working. So class this semester, a couple weeks back, I'm talking about this text we've read from the 4th century, and I pause for a moment, I'm like, did people find this text easy to understand? And like, no hands went up. It's like, okay, we're gonna do this class a little differently, because I, specialist in the 4th century, was like, this is a great thing to read. And everyone else is like, I battled with it for hours, Dr. Rivera, and I still don't know what it's saying. In other classroom environments I've been a part of, the emperor would have had no clothes that whole class session. But at Wake Divinity, there's a boldness that comes from the humility and the genuine curiosity and the genuine openness that our students embody and that I think we embody as a school as a whole.
You can tell that my colleague studied at the University of Chicago, you know, where fun goes to die. Because, but I would just second your point. It is the conversations. Teaching courses where I'm trying to pour my knowledge into your head are really, really boring. What we enjoy here are bringing new problems and hearing your input. Again, that's how iron sharpens iron. That's how disagreements lead to better ideas. That's how being an ecumenical school invites robust discussion in a way that is enlightening. You know, the day that I'm not trying to learn something from my class is the day I need to retire.
Thank you all for that. Neal, you said we have to be nimble because we don't know what's coming. Sometimes it's our students who help us to see what's coming. So with that, I open the floor to any questions out here in the audience or comments. Yes, sir.
Professor, you mentioned I think the tensions or the difficulties when the students came back from Selma, and I certainly understand. I've been to Selma, and I had a different experience from what you or they might have had, but I mean, I know what that's like. But I guess my question is, what exactly were they struggling with beyond the pain of what they saw? Were there other dynamics? And if there were, I'm just intrigued by those.
So I didn't give context. The class was civil rights and black religious experience. And so we had, leading up to the spring break trip to Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma, I did a very fluid and lengthy history of not only slavery, but also civil rights and the role of the church and Christian formation within that context. And there's one thing about showing film and lecturing and having conversation based upon the books that we read in class. There's a whole nother thing experiencing these spaces in person, in real time, being amongst and within the church where 4 little girls were essentially killed via hate, right? And then leaving that space to go to another museum to engage other forms of not only disregard for black flesh, but also the way in which those people were able to find their humanity in part through faith, right? But that's just day 1, or day 2, technically. We go to Montgomery and we learn of King and what he is pushing for in his first and only church that he would lead as senior pastor, and juxtaposing that to what was happening on the ground with the Montgomery bus boycotts, right? So by the time we get to Selma, we've done a whole lot. And we go to Selma, we study issues related to voting rights, we cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and at that point, that is the last formal thing that we do over a 4-day period, and folks are processing all of that simultaneously, right? So what I've learned, and still what Tyra and I were discussing over lunch, is how to create opportunities, and Dr. Sampson and I talk about this too. How do we create opportunities for full expression and wrestling with what is challenging material, and do it in such a way where unsung voices are heard and allowed to tell and craft their narratives about how they process this material. So that's what we were trying to do.
Other questions? I think we have a little more time for a conversation. Mm-hmm.
I'm Matt McLeod. I graduated here 2015. I want to thank, first of all, each of the professors. You've enlightened us today, and you certainly enlightened my life. I struggled to get through divinity school. If it were not for the support of the faculty and staff, I would not have made it. I want to say to you, Dr. Hicks, that I was at Cooperstown at the Hall of Fame for the induction of David Ortiz. I remember in your class, you're commenting on him. Dr. Walls, I remember your class vividly, struggling to understand the hieroglyphics that you passed around to each of us as students. Dr. Shane, I never had the pleasure of taking you for the New Testament. And I think next to you is a man who graduated from the University of Chicago. My brother-in-law, who's now deceased, is a graduate of the business school at the University of Chicago, as is his son. It's a great school. And Dr. Hicks, you're a graduate of one of the best schools in Texas and in the country, Rice University. I was privileged to learn from most of you, and I thank you.
Brother Mac, I can't believe it's been 9 years.
Can I just add right here while we're moving the mic? We began as a ragtag group of Bill Leonard's irregulars, but again, I actually take great pride in having built a faculty over the past 25 years, that we have always tried to hire people better than ourselves, and I would say I think we've succeeded quite well in building the Div School to what it is now, as opposed to what it was when we began.
My question is for Dr. Walls. Dr. Walls, during your presentation, you spoke about the DF school starting as post-denominationalism. And as a member of the AME Zion Church, a mainline Methodist denomination, seeing the decline in denominationalism. But then you said post-congregationalism. And I would like for you to take a moment, if you can, to just unpack that a little bit, because I'm also seeing the decline in congregation members coming back post-pandemic. So could you speak more about that, please?
I can add a few words and then defer to my colleagues who know more about this. Again, in 1999, Bill Leonard already was talking about living in a post-denominational future. And again, people of my generation thought of the 1950s as like the standard, when you have all the, where everyone goes to church on Sunday morning if they're at all Christian, and you dress up and you make business deals, and it's a social hour. And what historians like Bill and others know is that, no, that was actually the anomaly. Both throughout the history of the America and since then, that was the high point. And so we kind of had leveled off. And the future was going to be even less denominational powerhouses. What we've seen over the past 20 years, as I understand it, but particularly after the pandemic, is that even congregations, which as a Baptist is what I've always focused on, are new things now, that is, having gone on Zoom, etc. And so again, I'm going to defer to the conversation earlier this morning, and particularly my colleague, Dr. Sampson, who envisioned the new forms of church that will be taking place in public spheres, online, and in ways other than churches. I was shocked to learn recently about one school, and actually, Dr. Rivera, you can talk about this. It was an Episcopal school that closed down, and they had all the money in the world and nice buildings, but they didn't have students. You want to add to that?
I don't have much more to add to that particular story beyond that, but I think it points to the theme of everything we've been talking about, and the theme of continuing to be open to a future that we ourselves do not yet imagine. And that is something that is always necessarily uncomfortable, but it's something that we as Christians who value things like faith and hope should be equipped to step into that uncertainty. And so, yeah, I don't know that I can add much more to the idea of post-congregational. Despite being a younger member of the faculty, I often still feel like I'm so denominationally old-fashioned because I've been a Methodist my whole life, and I can't imagine being anything else. But that's why I'm the history professor, I guess. But I think that's all I can add to that.
I want to draw in one more thing that we heard earlier this morning that I think also pulls on Dr. Hicks and on part of what I was saying, was that these gatherings that aren't church, that haven't been sanctioned, they've been happening from the beginning. Fotini is the example of that, right? So while we are moving into a new sort of normative space of church, the non-normative has always been there on the margins, underneath, in the hush harbors, on the fringes, and those folks who we sometimes call heretics, or we sometimes call subversives, are showing us the need to be in community, the need to come together around God, the need to seek God in whatever form that is. These were faithful folks. These are faithful folks. And we need to continue to try and hear their voices and honor the wisdom that comes from those spaces.
So I'll add to that. Dr. Shana's words are making me think just how robust in black religious circles black women's voices have been. strictly. When we go from, I'll say it this way. There's a reason why Toni Morrison decides, as the kind of representation of black religious life, leadership at its best, chooses a broken black woman who decides to invert herself from brokenness, who has been forced to speak and to kind of help white families to pick herself up and help her own people, Baby Suggs Holy. And if I think about the way in which sisters like Nanny Helen Burroughs and the black women who led the Baptist Women's Conference in 1900, their mode of operation was not the church. They often weren't invited to churches to speak, and yet they were some of the most prolific women who were creating a platform to lead black people out of the doldrums and the vestiges of slavery, where they had yet to expunge degradation from their lives, and into a future understanding of possibility. It was through leadership that this was happening. And so I think, when I think about the work that Dr. Sampson is doing and has been doing, it is in this lineage that we've got to think critically about what theological future and possibility has been and can be. We talk about my grandmom all the time because she still will call me and have a word. One thing that I do now when I go to Los Angeles and I see her at 96 years old, she still says the same prayer every single time she eats. And it's a larger prayer than just for this food, and I record it now. And I realize the extent to which what she's doing outside of the walls of the church, either on her porch or in her living room, is disclosing the full breadth and nature of what it means to call a God to express oneself in one's own full humanity. Black women have been doing this outside of the church since the beginning. Charlotte Fett said it. Charlotte Fett, a white woman, said this in her book Working Cures, that it's black women on plantations who lead this. So that's another way for us to think about what our theological future might be.
If I could add something just to this conversation that my colleagues have already touched on. In one sense, we are entering something new. But one of the things I impress on all my students in my history classes is sometimes the new is not as new as you think it is. When you get deep into the history, you find this is how it's always been, often in places that get left out of the official mainstream history. And I'm thinking actually of a text that I like to teach that those of you can read with me next semester if you take my class, Poets Questioning God. I don't know if Jason's in the house, but he may want to cover his ears. It's a poem from the 14th century called Piers Plowman. 14th century, long ago, England, surely they didn't have these same problems. The poem ends with the figure whose name is Conscience deciding to leave the physical building of the church and to go in search of the Holy Spirit, wandering as a pilgrim through the earth. This is not a new phenomenon that we are facing today, where the old structures maybe, sometimes they do have the power they used to, sometimes they don't meet the nature of the life that we are finding ourselves in, but God is still living and active in our world. Sometimes we just have to step out of where we have been comfortable to find where the Holy Spirit is already at work.
If I can also add to that, in thinking about the new spaces or the non-normative spaces in which we find God and we celebrate God, one of those spaces is also queer spaces, and particularly even just thinking about the Black and Latino queer experience. And in my opening remarks, I made reference to, celebrating the bodies that spin and dip and vogue. And I could have gone on with a duck walk and a catwalk and all of these things that are part of the house ball community, that are spaces where people who have been ostracized from the church, from their family, from their communities can come together and they can celebrate their embodiedness. And even when we think about the music of those spaces, right? And we think about how gospel music was interpolated into house music. And it was nothing to hear the Clark sisters, You Brought the Sunshine, as part of that worship experience, right? That space where you can come to be it's almost like the Baby Suggs moment, like, out there they do not love your flesh, but here, right? And so I want to also invoke that there are those queer spaces, and particularly intersectional queer spaces, where we can also learn a lot in terms of adding to theology.
So our voices are always evolving, and our knowledge of God is always evolving. And as we celebrate 25 years now, 25 years later, this panel will possibly look different, right? And if you can speak, or if you could leave a word of encouragement to the students of 2050 and to the panel of 2050, what would that be?
I'm glad I'm just moderating.
So the first thing that came to my mind is not a word of encouragement. Well, it is. Okay, it is. The first thing that came to my mind was, I hope they find the injustice in what I've been teaching. And it is to say that every generation justice looks different. Every generation compassion looks different. Every generation reparation looks different. And I hope, I don't want to be unjust or uncompassionate or unreparative, but I also know that, we heard from Dr. Senior this morning, that I know that the wounds of our lives are the same things we live with in the joys of our lives. And so I hope that 50 years, you said 25 years from now, I hope 25 years from now, if anyone's talking about my scholarship, they're also finding the ways that I didn't get it right for that generation. And hopefully people will be talking about my scholarship.
Any other words of encouragement for 25 years from now, students?
I think this is a good example of our students giving excellent questions and really thought-provoking questions. I think, something similar to what my colleague said, that if 25 years from now we can look back at this moment, we can look back at it in the same way we've been looking back today at the founding of this school, as both a source of continuing inspiration, but also an inspiration to move forward in a new way that was not imagined 25 years ago. If there's something that's in our DNA as a divinity school of this openness to newness and the nimbleness that my colleague spoke of, that continues to be a continuity, even as that sort of continuity necessarily means that things will look very different as we continue to truly be open to what is beyond ourselves.
Stephen, I encourage you to make a better pot of gumbo than me 25 years from now. Excellent question, though.
Thank you all. Can we give our panelists one last round of applause? Once again, thank you for your wisdom, thank you for your courage, and thank you for bringing yourselves to us. We are indebted to you. It is wonderful to be here to celebrate. My prayer is that in the next 25 years, as we go out from here, the Wake Div to come will be willing to take risks as we have, and to continue to follow the love that we all seek as we come together to follow our God.